Excellent. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Teams Tuesday here with eGroup. So going to go through our normal kind of quick intros here. If you haven't joined us before, this will be new to you. If you have, it's going to be what we've covered before. So we're going to go over the quick intro on what Teams for Tuesday is. We'll talk about what's new in Microsoft Teams. Then we're going to move into the questions and the answers. So these are predetermined questions that I have that I've provided answers for. And then we'll head on out, right? We'll tell you how to get in contact with us or how to ping us with any other additional questions. So real quick, again, Teams for Tuesdays. We've been running this now for a few months on every Tuesday. We try to schedule that time between 11 and 11:30 a.m. To have those. We are moving to a bi-weekly schedule rather than weekly. So the next one will be October 13th, right? That one's actually be on extending Teams and kind of some interactions in there, maybe with how it works with some of the Power Platform bits. Now, there is a Q&A box here in this event that we're running here in this Teams event. So if you have a questions as we go on, feel free to enter those in the box now. I don't have a moderator watching those questions for me today, but once we close up, I will go back to the questions. I'll publish them and answer them out. So if you have a question there and you want me to answer that, just hang out a bit towards the end. Or if you're going to drop off, just be sure that we know who you are, and we're happy to follow up via email. So eGroup, we've been around for quite a while, right? So over 20 years. We are a Microsoft Gold partner. As you can see here, the cloud productivity cloud platform, that's essentially the gold competencies around Microsoft's Azure and their modern workplace. So modern workplace is the Office 365 and Office 365 bits. We have a tremendous CSAT rating. As you can see, we continue to be successful with our customers, and both in rolling out technology, but also building stories around those solutions. One thing to note, though, is we're not just a cloud company. We do work in data center, traditional data center deployments, and hybrid as well, tying them together, right? It's very rare that you have somebody that's all on premise nowadays or all in the cloud. Usually it's a bit of both. So I myself am Jesus Shelby. I'm director of the Cloud Managed Services team here. I've been with you for 8 years. I have a pretty deep technical background on the Microsoft side of things and security side of things. All right, so what's new this week? Well, nothing really hit Teams as far as any of the updates that were pushed out. Now, that does happen. Occasionally we'll have a week or 2 weeks where nothing comes out, and then we might get 3 or 4 features. And I do expect that eventually to happen because Ignite was last week, and they've announced a ton of new features they're working on. One thing I've actually seen that's currently in a private preview, at least inside of Microsoft, is the ability to have breakout rooms, which that's come up a few times in Teams, as if Teams can do that. So that will be coming soon. It seems to be functional, at least inside of Microsoft. So hopefully we'll get that in the preview soon. If you're interested on all of the new things they announced last week at their conference, right? And it's an IT conference, so it's pretty technical, but you can go to Book of News. I have the URL here on the screen, but if you really just type Ignite 2020 Book of News, it's going to come up in your search and you'll be able to go there and see. And they've broken it out into kind of the technology areas between like the Azure Power Platform, Teams, and so forth. And there was a ton of new things that they introduced at the conference last week. So if you're interested, check it out. Like I said, lots of good stuff out there. Okay, so this week with our teams, we're going to talk about security and governance and some of the questions that I've gotten around there. This is the big question that we usually start with because it's the one I normally get right off the bat, is people try out Teams, they turn it on, and they realize that everybody by default can create teams. Not just that, when you're in Teams, there's actually multiple places to do it. So if I'm in the Teams client, I can click create a team, it's going to create a team. If I'm in Outlook, I can create an Office 365 group that will give me the option to be attached to a team. If I'm in SharePoint, I get those options. If I deploy something like Planner, those options are there. So there's multiple places where you can actually start interacting with the Microsoft Teams site that it creates. And sometimes that scares people a little bit on the tool itself, and they want to limit that. And I would say take that on a case-by-case basis, whether or not you need to limit that, but there is a way to do it. There's a lot of scripting on this page. Go ahead and disregard that. If Microsoft has actually publication out there, their public website that goes over that. And if you're interested in that, let me know. I can send you that link, or I can send you this code directly, so you're not trying to copy or manage it off this slide. But it can only be managed via PowerShell. And I do want to make a note that you actually have to have an additional license potentially, right? And that's their Azure Active Directory Premium 1. And that's not needed for every single user. It's needed only for the users that you're going to add to a security group that will then be assigned the ability to create teams, right? So essentially, we're going to block access for everyone to create teams and give that right only to a security group. And that's what all of this script does here. And those users would need it. So if there's only 2 or 3 users, then you only need 2 or 3 of these additional licensing. If you have these already, so for instance, if you have EMS, no worries there, it's already assigned to your users, so you can go ahead with this here. There are some exceptions to know on this, is there are privileged user roles that would be exempt from this policy. So if you have a global administrator role, you essentially always have rights to do everything, which includes creating sites. If you're an Exchange admin, for instance, you'll actually have those rights to go into some of the Exchange tools and still create them. Same thing with SharePoint administrators. And there's a few other roles in there where the different tools can give you an interface into creating teams that would be exempt for those. So really, if you just understand that if you have an administrator or content owner that has a privileged role, they may be able to actually still create teams in a certain manner. So just bear that in mind as you're thinking through your strategies on that. So another big question we get is when people start playing with this, they go into create teams. They want to know like the difference between private, public, and an org-wide team. So these 3 types of classifications do have some different functionality involved. And sometimes they can be confusing, especially over the private and the public piece. When I deploy a new team and I create it as private, I will be the owner and I'll have the ability to add members at the time of creation. And then only that group really have access to the site, right? So if I add 3 other team members, the 4 of us will have access to that site, and nobody else will have access unless I grant them access, right, as the team owner. If they go in and go to find a team, so if somebody's browsing a team, these private teams don't show up in that catalog. Right now, public teams, on the other hand, work very similar. So when I create it as a team owner and I'm going to add my members, that's the initial core group, right? And not everybody has access, same as the private group. The difference is that public group is visible. So somebody searching for a site can actually see that in the Teams interface, and they can request to join. And depending on how I've got that team set up, they might automatically be added, or it might just go as a team owner, say, hey, do you want to allow this person in? And they can approve that inside of the team settings. And then they're a member of the team. So functionality-wise, behind the scenes, it's all the same, but it's all about that visibility on the front end. Org-wide teams. This is important. Is you can only do this when you're a global administrator. You'll get this option. Normal users don't have this option. And by default, basically what it means is I create a team and everybody that's in the org there, so everybody in the directory that has a login into the cloud system could actually go to that team, interact with that team, and be a part of that team. On this slide, you'll notice I have some limits here over to the right. So important notes here is currently today, the membership of our private and public groups have actually been bumped up. So you can have up to 10,000 members in every one of these groups. Now, org-wide teams, however, are still limited to only 5,000 users. So if your organization has over 5,000 users, you're not going to want to use an org-wide team because it's not really going to be org-wide. It's not going to manage for all of those individuals. They are in the process of moving that up. I expect that at some point is going to match our public and private teams for 10,000 members. But even at that point, bear that in mind, because if you have over 10,000 members, an org-wide team is not necessarily going to work for you. And before I move off this, let's bring up a Teams really quick and I can show you where that is. So when we're looking at the Teams interface, you will see down here on the Teams channel, we can join or create a team. So here, because I'm in the admin, I don't have a lot here in my demo tenant, but if I had other teams here, I would actually see them in this view and I could join them if they're a public team. As a private team, I can get a code from the team admin, right? Or they can just add me explicitly. And if I click here, you'll see I have admin rights. Let's go from build from scratch, and you'll see I have, these are where those options show up. And again, a user won't see this unless they have admin rights. Okay, and then next question, is after we get the basics, people want best practices. So for me, I don't really like the term necessarily best practices when it comes to tools like Microsoft Teams, the collaboration kind of content, because one best practice for one org is not necessarily going to be the best practice for another org. Even in similar industries, right? Because it's really how you work is based on the organization and the culture inside of the organization that kind of determines what needs to happen there. That being said, there are some things you can think about when you're getting ready to roll teams out and how you want that to be perceived, right? So first one we kind of talked about, who can create teams, and as far as who can't, right? So do I want to limit that down to admins? Do I want to keep it open? Am I worried about what goes out there? Coming up with that kind of early on. And there can be a bit of both, right? It's not an absolute answer that you necessarily need there. So for instance, you could get a little more advanced beyond just locking it down. You could set up, maybe an automation, kind of a form where users can go request, that uses a service account to request the teams, and then it goes through an approval process. Maybe you have some content owners that kind of vet the teams as they're going through, making sure it makes sense. So that still gives you the flexibility of letting users create them, not necessarily have IT own everything, and still keep that process flowing. So there's a lot of a variance between everybody creates it and nobody creates it there. Naming conventions are important. Do you want these teams to have specific names? It is possible to say, for instance, email a channel or a team. You can have those, and naming conventions help with that. Will you be able to share content here, right? Do you want guest users to participate in some of these teams? And if you do, how do you want to manage that? Do you want to have a dedicated space for that? Are they going to interact with existing teams and existing users? That's really based on the risk profile of the organization and what you're sharing and what you feel the risk level in the content is there. How are we going to handle retention? Do we need to hold things, or do we have a legal requirement to hold content around there? Or same thing when we layer in that guest external users, do we want to use DLP to prevent, say, PII being placed in a team channel, right? Those are decisions we kind of want to make up front and start working around that. Even at least at a minimum with messaging, and policy before we start enabling technical controls. And then the last one, how are you going to monitor and manage it? And that really has to do with what you choose before. If it's wide open and you want people more or less to manage it, maybe you're not going to be in there a lot. But if it's more locked down, or even a subset are, you might want to create some things there, right? We have adoption reports, monitor reports in the Office 365 admin portal. You have the Teams admin portals. You have the SharePoint admin portal that manage kind of sites and content. If we're running DLP and retention, we have reports on those labels and those activities. And a lot of that can also be, put out into other systems. So if you have other things that you're using for tracking security and auditing, that might have a wider conversation on how that gets integrated. So, again, it's not one size fits all, but taking in what I just spoke about and understanding kind of some higher level concepts will also help. Right? If you think of Teams as a security boundary, that's really how you want to wrap things. Don't think you have a team and then you have your multiple channels. If you have people that are interacting in those multiple channels, you usually want them all to be the same, right? And a good way to think of that is maybe from project analogies, right? So if I have a customer and we do multiple projects for that customer, I might create a team to house all of those channels. Every one of those channels might be a different project, but then that team is going to have members that are essentially the project team across all of those projects, right? That way they only go to one place to look in there to see where their status is. Now, if I have an internal, maybe an engineering team where those guys go in, they pilot some things, or they're running some questions behind the teams that maybe doesn't need to be visible in the project channel, because that project channel potentially maybe includes external users, I would have a separate team for that, because the membership of that team is different, right? Where you can group those together and minimize the amount of teams really helps with the interaction in teams and the uptake. So instead of creating 5 teams where all the members are the same, consider one team and then maybe 5 channels in there. The other thing is the org-wide teams. Of course, there is a limit, I believe, of 5 org-wide teams. So if you can support that today and you want to use that, just know that there's a hard limit on that. And I haven't really seen a need more than maybe 1, possibly 2 org-wide teams, even in those scenarios. So I wouldn't use that as my go-to. in that fashion, right? And a visual kind of to help with that. If any of you have a background with maybe SharePoint and some things like that, or if you worked with us or eGroup in the past, you might have seen something similar to this. And really what it shows at the top, right? If we have like the company-wide audience and everybody gets to see it, we usually limit the contributors to those, right? A lot of times that's more like a communications focus. Think like your intranet home pages. You want a few people to control the information that gets on there, that approve it, and then it goes out to the entire company. And as we go down the pyramid, what we're doing is limiting that audience, right? So the audience gets smaller as we talk about divisions, departments, and work groups are kind of anything, small work groups, project teams, even potentially subsets of engineering teams and so forth, right? Those are the lowest tier, probably the least amount of control needed there. And, you know, that's another way to think about how can I organize teams. And Teams does work great with SharePoint, like from a traditional intranet's perspective, right? You might have your normal intranet sites in SharePoint, your collaboration sites in Teams, and you can still tie some of those together. So for instance, you can use, extending the functionality with tabs and so forth to put, say, intranet pages inside of the team sites as well to keep them connected, or have links to Teams inside of your intranet pages. So everything's kind of tied together there. And different ways to do it. You know, everybody has a different interaction point on how they have their intranet set up and so forth. So hopefully those help when you start thinking through these deployments and different activities and the governance up front on how you want to structure them and deploy teams in the environment. Okay, so here's one. I labeled this one, right? The question you may not know to ask about DLP. So those of you that already have Office 365 and at least like the E3 and above know that data loss prevention is part of those SKUs, right? So for a while, our chats and channels were not covered in that, and they are now. However, they're in a separate SKU. So if you have an E3, or if you have less like an F3 or a business premium or something, and you have the DLP add-on, your data loss prevention rules will cover mail and exchange, content in SharePoint, and content in OneDrive. So from that perspective, at least where Teams concerned, DLP will work on the files and such that you share, right? But the gap is in the chat service. So the chat service is actually not hosted anywhere in like the Office 365 platform. Teams is built on a chat service that rests in Azure. So they have a separate DLP for Teams specifically. That is included in an Office 365 E5 or Microsoft 365 E5. You would have that, so you would have both. If you don't, let's say you have an E3 and you wanted to add that, then you would add an add-on license, which is called the Microsoft 365 E5 compliance add-on. So there's an additional cost to bring that in there. And that DLP rule set is going to cover your chats, both your one-on-one chats as well as your chats inside of the channels. Now, I don't show it here. There's a complementary piece of DLP here as well, and that's kind of communication governance, right? Is what's going in chats. In Teams, we can do things, the little memes and extra things in there. But if you want to filter for content, let's say you're looking for troubled phrases, threats, words, and those type of things. So out of the box, that's not available to you. However, Microsoft does have an additional add-on license called their Advanced Communications Plan, which does offer some of that capability. So know that's out there. Haven't seen a lot of use in that, or a lot of desire to get control down to that particular level. But depending on your organization and your compliance rules, you may need that granular level of access. And is there anything I'm missing? Nope, I think that's about it, just understanding those. Okay, what are some of the mature advanced options that help with security and governance? Well, one that's not really out there that you don't see right off the bat is you can integrate Azure Information Protection, which you may find different verbiage here in how this works. So Azure Information Protection is part of the EMS suites. So you're normally going to get the P1 level, but if you have EMS E5, that's P2, but you can use both in this instance. But you would need that to make this work. So you can set up a Teams or a SharePoint Teams to use classification levels. And what that will allow you to do then is to create a policy based on this label to then control some of the aspects of the team. So for instance, we can actually enforce whether a team is private or public, and then we can enforce whether or not guest users can be a part of that team. And you might do this in a scenario. So for instance, we want people to share with external users. We want those project work groups to be able to share it out. In order to do that at an organizational wide level, I have to have sharing turned on. I can't turn that off. But I have a subset of sites that I want to keep, out of my public views for users to scroll through. I don't need people seeing search and content from it. And I'm never going to add guest users from it, right? So in that case, I could have this classification label that I apply to this team when it's created, or behind the scenes, there's not a UI element. You can go through PowerShell and apply these to pre-existing teams, but that handles those restrictions, right? So the project team can go invite external users. That will work fine. But now I've created this team where I've blocked that. So anybody that tries to invite somebody over to this content team site was not going to be able to do that. It's going to get restricted regardless of the level of access that the person actually has, right? Because we've basically put it on that container boundary. Now, important thing to note when you go this route out of the box, it also does not necessarily apply directly to content. There are different ways we would do that, but you can label content. If you have the MSE5, you can use the auto classifiers and throw those in there. And there's some certain tagging we can do as far as adding that as part of the label policies when things go into SharePoint, but that usually requires us defining sensitivity information types on how we find those documents that are going to be classified, right? So it's not necessarily library wide, but there are different ways to handle that depending on the use case that we get into. So it's out there. Know that you can do this. It's not going to be straightforward. When you're going through Teams documentation, you may not see this, but it is available. Okay, the other option are Teams templates. So you can create Teams templates, right? So one thing we had in here before is if I bring this up real quick, and everybody should see this if they're in Teams. When you join or create a team again, I'm going to say create a team. Notice I have this create from. Out of the box, it's going to let me select a pre-existing team or group that's in my list, right? So this is the easiest way you could do this. Going back to our project analogy, I might have a project that we set up continuously and use the same template where, okay, this channel has a link that goes to our PMM or our PM tool. Maybe we have some documents that we post for each one of those. Whatever content that seems to be like on every project that you do, you can pre-create that team, just give it a name that you can recognize it like template, and then you can have it in here, and then every time like the PM team goes and creates it, they can select that, and that's their template. So that's the easiest way to go through and do that. Now, you can also integrate this if you have some type of continuous deployment mechanism, or if you wanted to automate this. Remember we talked before, maybe have a controlled form with an automated process. A user selects what they want, and you have some pre-configured templates that you'd like to use. You can use the API here, right? So we can make calls to the Microsoft Graph. We throw a configuration. The configuration is all in JSON. For any of you that have gotten behind the scenes in any of the Microsoft Cloud products, they all use JSON now for their configurations. And Teams, is the same. And we would build it out to what we want. What do you want the name to be? What do you want the channels to do? Do we want to post anything in the channels? Do we want to have tabs? Anything like that could be in here, right? It falls along the lines of extending Teams, but from a governance perspective, it can keep things kind of in a box if you desire. Now, Microsoft also has some predefined templates out there that you can use for this process, but they do require the API to actually deploy them. Okay. Another question I've gotten, actually getting this more frequently, is it possible to record a Teams meeting without a notification? So if you're in there, I mean, this one's a live meeting, so it's a little bit different, but if you have a normal Teams meeting, when somebody records it, you usually get that bar at the top and it says this meeting's being recorded, right? Sometimes people are like, does that have to be there? Yes, right? So as you see here, for a general license, it's always going to be there every time you click it. Now, the other side is that, for instance, is like I can't automatically record a meeting. I can't go in and barge into a meeting or a call, right? If somebody's on there as a supervisor. Those are some more advanced features there that are available in that advanced communication license that I mentioned before. So when you have that, you can set up things like compliance recordings, right? A lot of this is more like contact center work that you would think where this would be the norm and required. but you can set that up. You also have kind of that barge-in capability, the ability to record without notifications, which could be a requirement in some cases. Now, generally speaking, I mean, we're talking like legal here, right? Where there's an order, somebody's monitoring somebody for something, some kind of behavior, but that's how that would be done. You'd have to have an add-on license there. And that COM license retails at about $12 per user. That's going to be under effect. So again, I don't see wide deployments of it. It's fairly new. Definitely with like contact center things that are coming up, when we talked about Teams Voice before on some of these Tuesday webinars, that comes into play because that opens up the APIs that a lot of those contact centers use as well, you know, for those same functionalities, same things, recording, barge-in, those type of things. So great, guys, that's the last one I had for today. If you're curious or you have questions, you want to reach out, give us a call. We can talk more about your governance and security on Teams. Look at how you're managing creation. Do you want to look at those automated workflows, that type of thing? Need help locking it down, licensing questions. You know, happy to help with all of that. And the info at egroupus.com, that comes in, that hits a lot of us internally, so we'll get back to you. You can also call the direct line that I've got in there. And, you know, last slide here, we're on you know, Twitter, we're on LinkedIn. If you go to LinkedIn, I know that this link is long, but just type in, you know, eGroup, you'll find us in there. And that number and that email there. And let's see, going to do a quick check. It doesn't look like we've got any questions. So there's no questions to currently publish or put out there. So I'm going to say thank you everyone for joining. And again, reach out if you have anything, any questions, and if we can help. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.